Hi everyone, I'm Andy Kerr. I'm Head of Regeneration at City of York Council, and I'm the project lead for the Castle Gateway regeneration. And I've got Matthew Costa here with me today, who is our landscape architect from BDP, and they've been working with us to help design up the Castle and Eye of York public realm space, which will replace Castle Car Park and look at how the Eye of York develops as part of that wider space. We're currently working up the designs. We've been responding to all the public engagement that's been undertaken to help us provide an open brief for this area, which we've been responding to. And then as we've been sharing designs with people, we're continually trying to refine those designs and make sure that we've got them right and that they're being shaped by our stakeholders and the general public in York, so that when the planning application goes in, it's a really exciting world-class public space that we've created to replace what is currently a car park. So one of the key issues that we've been dealing with now is particularly around the Eye of York and that area that already exists as a public space, to look at how we can maybe improve that space, look at the history of the area and really respond to the brief the public have given us. So Matthew's been working really hard on that, and what we want to do is share some emerging designs today. And we're at a point in the process we really need to start to pick on which of the options that we go with for the planning application. So this is to explain where we are, and hopefully this video will start to continue some of the really exciting public debate around how we use this space and how the designs emerge. So Matthew, I think you're going to share your screen.
Yeah. Bear with me 1 second. Yeah, can you see that?
Yep, we can, yeah. So I think firstly, we wanted to just have a quick look at the Eye of York as a historical space and how it's developed over that period of time, Matthew, didn't we?
Yeah, so I mean, we've got a number of slides here that show, I suppose, the history of the site and how it's changed over time. And then we're going to end that with, I suppose, where we are at the moment, the current design thinking and how we've got to that point. So hopefully it'll be an interesting video.
So obviously today it's looked as it is, I guess, for the last 40 years, where there's been a sort of formalized sort of circular lawn area with a tree in the middle, but it's not always looked like that. It's obviously there was this sort of period before the female prison building and what is the Crown Court building today were added to create that set piece. But obviously it didn't have that feel that it has today. It was much more of an open square area. And I think we've got a few more images just showing how it has started to change over time.
I mean, you can kind of see as well that it's that, you know, whilst this is probably an artist piece, yeah, is quite a hard space originally, and a lot of people gathering there, and you know, it was sort of fit to the uses that went on in that space. So you know, it's not always been the sort of green oval that we see today.
And there's some sort of historic maps of the area, really, which shows how the area did start to change. So you've got the castle area there that by sort of the 1800s, that's where you've got the area that it kind of looks like today, where you've added in those sort of two buildings that sit around then the circular grass area, but then the Victorian prison came into the space and some plans there that looked at the whole area. So some of these weren't actually plans that were realized, but did start to show the point in time where the space started to change. But notice as well, huge walls surrounded that whole area. This wasn't necessarily a public accessible area. It was one that was very closed off to the public. So just move on. So then it's the 1960s. We kind of get to that point where this has sort of emerged as I guess we start to see it today. And some of that will be responding particularly to sort of vehicles, and obviously this was the last big intervention for the whole area, was responding to the car and more car ownership and vehicles being a more dominant space. But I guess it's really started to lose that sort of formality there, Matthew, hasn't it, and the way it's responding to those different buildings, and has become more then about that circle of grass by 1960.
Yeah, it's something that the circle was there, but obviously, you know, this has led on to what it is today, you know, with being sort of vehicular dominated and how that, you know, how some of these edges work. And I think the circle almost, it allows the sort of edges to be sort of evenly treated, which I think is a good thing. But then equally, you know, over time, it's been very much distorted. And sort of not abused, but they've got sort of ad hoc parking and all sorts of things going on that are associated with having a carriageway around the edge of it. So, the form has changed, but equally it's lended itself to some of its problems that it's got today, I think.
And I think the road really changes the way it's sort of interacted with, hasn't it? Because again, I think we'll see in another slide, just one on again, the use of that space. It was a green area, a space that was used. We've got images of people playing tennis on there in the 1930s. And that space, obviously the prison being in there, but you can see there are tennis courts on that and people playing tennis. I think we tweeted about it in the middle of Wimbledon from my Castle Gateway a couple of years ago. Yeah, there we go. But obviously that space there had a use and it had a purpose, I guess, and was used around that. But the road sort of then started to sever that, I guess, and made it, people don't tend to now go into that space as much. People sort of walk around the road. And then I think the other issue is a tree, isn't it? And how the tree started to then define that space, which sort of planted in 1981. And I think we could see on just a couple of those earlier shots, Matthew, if you just flick back, it as a sapling really, as it had gone in. I think that's from 1982, and you can just see it very, very sort of just sort of visible in the middle there, very vaguely, and sort of obviously that was a sapling, which I mean, again, I think is obviously 40 years ago. It shows how quickly those trees can suddenly grow and become big mature trees as it is at the moment, and a tree really sort of dominates that space. But we see there people using that space, and it's a really important part of the city, isn't it? That history of the space, the sort of the role it's played in shaping not just York but the wider Yorkshire and the country. Sort of the history of authority, the crown, the court purpose, but then also the public going into that space as well, and an area of protest and challenge back to power, and a space that sort of pre our generation, that was very much how it was used. So that's kind of led us on, as we've looked at all the history of that space, to really think about how we want to use it as our generation, and what histories we want to tell from the space, and how it reacts to the history of the buildings that are in place. And what the public have told us, that they want to be able to interact with the space better. We've got the museum in there, obviously that's been in there since the 1930s, and now they've used those buildings and reused those buildings. And I think there's a real desire of the museum to expand and to reimagine the museum, and an outdoor space that could give them a curation space like they've created at the rear of the art gallery. It really gives an opportunity potentially for this space to have more of a counterbalance to maybe more of a commercial events which could take place on the Castle car park area. This could be more of a cultural space, a reflective space, but a place people interact with and enjoy and understand the importance of those buildings that sit around it. And that's really driven sort of how we started to look at the designs for the space. We've also got to work with the courts because it's still a functioning Crown Court building. There's a lot of practicalities that go with that. So we need things which are quieter. We need to accommodate the ability for people in custody to be able to be transferred into the courts by prison van, which you can see a prison van actually there on that one, and some of the parking requirements that they have, and legal requirements that sit around that. So that's kind of where we've got to, Matt, isn't it? Instead of starting the process of a design evolution.
It was, and it's. You look at this image now, and you can kind of see it's quite a sterile space at the moment. Really, there's a tree in the middle. There's a big lawn space, and then there's a road. And actually, those edges are really defined by sort of ad hoc parking, the uses that are associated with some of these buildings. But it's quite a sterile space, and actually, it could do so much more. And the open brief and all the uses that are sent in the open brief, a place for people to gather, to dwell, to speak, to do a range of different activities. Yes, okay, you could do it here on a sunny day, but actually, when it's a rainy day, or when you actually want to have a large gathering or stuff like this, really restricts that sort of ability to do some of those day-to-day functions and some of those bigger functions. So we really want to pull out those uses, I think. So I suppose, it's just useful to show this existing image as the starting point. But should we go on to the options now?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah. So I suppose the fundamental thing here is what we're trying to do is create a central space that people can gather in, that sort of creates a space where people can speak, can do all sorts of different things, can sit down and enjoy, can work with both the court and the museum building, and essentially becomes a place that's associated for people and uses of people and not for vehicles and sort of all the sort of movements that are associated with the sort of way in which the space is configured today. So we're looking at creating a sort of central space, and that would be edged with seating or something that allows people to gather and look in, but that space becomes a point that's quite enclosed, I guess, and becomes a really quite significant space that allows those uses to either do the day-to-day functions or start talking to the significance of the space and the ability to talk to in the face of the power that is sort of personified by this area. And then the edges, having the trees and adding more trees into there just softens the edges and gives that sense of enclosure, but also creates a different sort of character. The use of shade and sunlight and shade to create that different sort of character. So actually it becomes almost a greener edge and a greener space, even with sort of the quantum of hard space in the area being increased. So
I think on these, Matt, we've started from the position of this is the blank canvas approach, isn't it? Where we say, right, what have the public told us they want to be able to do in the space? What is the history of this space and how it's developed? And if we were starting from that position, what would we want? What do we think the space would look like in an ideal world that met all those briefs? And that's kind of where we feel we are with this option, isn't it?
Yeah. And the simplicity, I suppose, we're trying to create a space that's quite simple, but allows some of those uses to happen. So I suppose the diagram that you can see here, you can see by the way that we're using materials and tree planting to really make it feel like it's a public space and that it's not something that allows sort of vehicles into it. It's really a public space first and foremost. And then it uses planting and seating to create that sort of central focus area that allows people to gather. And so this is a harder option. And again, we started testing this with what was said during the open brief and about the idea of bringing sort of more green space into the area. So we want to keep the significance of the space. We want to try and keep that place for people to gather, that place for people to be able to speak within the sort of the face of authority, but then also try and thread in some more green space. So this option that you see here is kind of a hard space, but then we've moved on to a sort of softer option, which has, it still has the sense of enclosure around the edges with the trees and still has the sort of seating to give that sense of a central space where things can happen. But then we've also looked at putting in planting, areas of lawn, just bits that people can actually sit and give a different sort of place to dwell within if it's a nice sort of, sunny day or something like that. So this is sort of an evolution of that harder option.
And it gives that space, and doesn't it, a space that can be used, and people are looking into that space. So things are taking place across there. People can be on all sides looking what's happening. And I think, I guess, just to speak around the tree for a second, obviously this design doesn't leave the tree in place that sits there at the moment, but that really allows you to sort of look across to the two buildings, which were very much designed to face each other into this space, doesn't it, Matt? So those views in and out of the area are really opened up by the tree not being there.
Yeah, and we've tried to, these trees, the positioning of the trees is aware of views, and we're trying to create key views to all of these significant buildings, be it the Court, Clifford's Tower, or even St Mary's, which is further afield. But removing that tree just allows that sort of I suppose that connection between those buildings, that visual connection between those buildings. So sort of the perimeter trees that you see here have been spaced, being mindful of those views, because obviously removing that tree allows us to create that sort of visual connection between those different buildings. So we have done that as part of the process.
And in terms of that as well, a couple of other things I guess that it allows it to happen is obviously more trees. It's replacing that existing tree with more trees. So in terms of biodiversity and the softer landscaping that we're bringing in there, but it also creates that buffer then to the court and really the court activity with that planting that takes place on that edge, and gives some of the sort of the privacy that the court needs from the space. But I think the key for me is that view through, isn't it? If you're sat on the female prison building, on the steps there, on the plinth, that reconnection back through to the building opposite, it creates that key connection through.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting that, you know, this central, you know, we've tried to put green space in here, but there is a decent hard space in the middle, and it is a space that can be curated, as well as all the things that we're talking about, you know, place of speaking, dwell space, all these things that I think are really important to do with the significance of the site. It's a space that can be curated by, you know, as a smaller event, well, not really events, but for things that you know, more appropriate in that sort of space. But it is a space that can be curated, you know, for various different uses.
I'm conscious there, Matt, we're delving into our kind of architect's language and the language culture. So curated space, I mean, effectively what we're saying is there is a space there. You've got the interpretation of Clifford's Tower, an English heritage piece, which is currently ongoing. You've got the museum and how the museum has got the opportunity to better tell the history of the space. And we think an outdoor space which could be used for that sort of exhibition purpose at different times of year, a space that could change throughout the year. Because we're very conscious, we really want to make Castle and Ivy York feel like a space that is used at all times of year. So we need things that obviously draw people into the space. But then also, I think there's the stuff that we've talked around potential for speakers' corners and some of those things that talk back to that sort of protest and opposition to power, and how individuals and communities could go in and use that space in different ways. That creates that formalized looking into the space, and sort of amphitheater is the wrong word, isn't it? But a space that people are looking into, that stuff can take place.
And that's what we've tried to, I suppose, drive us towards this option, is the ability to put those uses in there. And like you say, whether it's from you know, the museum, or whether it's you know, something to do with Clifford's Tower, or something to do with the museum, or something that's going on in there, or just simply it is a place where people are gathering because it's a significant place within all of Yorkshire, you know, and it is the place of power. So that central space, I think, could have real meaning for the people of York to be able to do a whole variety of different things in it.
Yeah, so I think that it's probably fair to say we've obviously we've tried to respond to the brief. We've been working with the Castle Gateway Advisory Group, and we've been sort of responding again to the public engagement we've had. I think for the reasons we've just set out, this is probably our preferred option as a design team, because we think it does all those things that the brief asked of us, and responding to the heritage significance of the area. And we've introduced that softer landscaping area to make it more of that again, biodiversity and that gardens feel, and place where people can sit and enjoy the grass as well. But we are very conscious as well that there are people through the process have questioned very much about the tree and whether the tree could be retained in that area. So it's something that we're very conscious of, and we've looked at. I think we've explained the reason why we've tried to look at it without the tree, because the tree is so dominant to that space and has been such a new addition, really. Again, sort of 1981, that tree was planted. But we have obviously looked at, well, what does the tree being in that space? And if you put the tree in there, you have to design around the tree, don't you, Matt? Because it is such a dominant feature.
It's quite it's the tree itself, you know, is you're right, it is a dominant feature. It sits in the middle of it, so it kind of drives you towards a more circular sort of form. Really, you know, you could test it. Well, we have tested the sort of the existing tree within a more sort of rectangular form that you see here on the screen, but it just didn't seem to work. It really sat sort of ajar with the sort of the I suppose the way in which the space is set out. So because it's such a sort of big thing, you know, big circular thing really in the middle of the space, it really informs it to be, it kind of works with more of a circle, oval, a more softer sort of shape to the space, basically.
We have got some options that look at that, haven't we?
Yeah, so I suppose this is, so just illustrative sketch, I suppose, is showing here, just showing, well, the existing tree is there. Well, actually, does it inform the way in which the space is set? But then can we create that sort of gathering point, you know, around the base of the tree? It's worth pointing out that because the tree is existing, we would probably have to keep an area of soft around the base of the tree. you wouldn't really be able to put hard all the way through to. So it's worth just understanding that, because again, that restricts the amount of space you have around it, because essentially you need to maintain those levels. So but yeah, essentially the tree sort of informs a shape of space. And so the options that we've got, or the options that we're looked at here, which is a sort of an oval and a more circular form, creates, it's still trying to do the things that the other option's doing. It's trying to put seating around the edges. It's trying to create a sense of enclosure around that central space, and it's trying to create a central space within the middle of it. And again, creating those connections between buildings, where we can. But like you say before, I suppose the downside to this is that there is a tree in the middle of it. So it really sort of, it doesn't limit use. There is obviously uses that can go on in there, because we're trying to do that because it has a hard space, but it doesn't have the sort of the breadth of different uses that the other options had where that tree was removed. And I think that's the thing. But this option you can kind of see here is more of an oval form. Again, we've still got the tree planting around the edges, seating, and then a sort of a central hard space that goes around the central tree. And the other option is very similar. It's kind of a circular form, again, sort of trying to tie in with the buildings themselves and trying to get this sort of circle to sit sort of comfortably within the space. But it's really the same sort of principles as the option before. It has a planted edge, has trees to give it a sense of enclosure, and it has the central tree within the middle of it.
I think one thing that's quite stark when you see that actually is just that it's not central, is it, the tree to the space?
No. Well, the space is quite odd. It seems like it's symmetrical, and it looks quite symmetrical. But if you look at the earlier image we had, which showed the space in the 1960s before the sort of museum extension was built, you can kind of see clearer that the buildings are sort of set away from each other at different sort of spacing. So I think because the museum extension came in, it tricks your eye in thinking that it's actually more of a symmetrical space than it actually is. And so you get these odd sort of, sort of angles and spaces. So that tree can't really sit in the middle of it, because it's all sort of slightly ajar from each other. So you're right. Yeah, it doesn't sit in the middle. It all sits slightly skew, which is again, I suppose it makes the tree sort of seem slightly odd where it is today.
Yeah. So I think where we are again as a sort of project team, we've obviously shown here that there is an option that can work with the tree. I think some of the big challenges that give us then is again that the ability to sort of understand those buildings as a set piece, and again that view of through to the two buildings, it sort of does sit bang in the middle of that and really sort of severs that view. And then the space as Matt's sort of spoken around, again, you end up, if people are sat trying to look into that space and look at what activity might be going on in there, whether that's sort of some kind of sculptures or an exhibition that's taking place, or some kind of performance, or somebody speaking in that space, again, you only be able to see them from, I guess, one half of the circle. Whereas on the other option without the tree, it's very much looking into a space that can be enjoyed from all sides of it. So I guess the key question we've been led to is we've really tried to do what we feel is the best historical significance and representation of that of the space and of what the public have asked for, and how we've tried to look at this as that curation space that we spoke about. And we feel that the other option is our preferred option, the better option. But we also know that there's very strong views around from some groups to keep the tree. So we just tried to explain the reasons we've designed our preferred option. But what we want to do really now is test with the public in a sort of real short, sharp way what the view is, having heard that explanation of the design that we've got, and whether we've got it right with our preferred option, or whether we're looking at some kind of alternative with the tree in place.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Matthew, for your time and just sort of giving us your expertise to talk us through that. This video will obviously sit there now, and we'll hope through social media and through the engagement that we're doing through My Castle Gateway, we'll get some feedback and we can start to refine the final plans that go in. So thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Great, thanks.